We're here for managing your manager. My name is Nicole Weibel, and as Yasir mentioned, we are former colleagues, and I am so grateful for the relationship that we built together in a relatively short period of time. So if you haven't engaged with Yasir, I recommend reaching out for career and life design coaching and support. So a little bit about me. I am an HR professional, so I am an organizational development manager. My educational background, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, but also in dance. My psych degree focused on social psychology, so self-esteem and motivation is where I supported research, and that led me into wanting to pursue higher education with a master's degree. So I found myself at Purdue University with an MSHRM, so a master's in human resource management, and grounded myself in kind of practical application of a lot of the psychology concepts that I had learned. Purdue really built a strong foundation for me, and I moved forward into a Leaders in Motion development program with the Defense Finance and Accounting Services. So that is basically payroll for a large portion of the Department of Defense here in the United States. It is a massive organization, and it was a really great experience to support from an HR perspective portions of the Department of Defense. I worked in recruitment there. So I worked in, they called it staffing and recruitment, and had a few promotions, developed into a team lead role, worked on some process improvement, got my green belt and my Lean Six certification there, and really found myself falling towards my passion of helping others learn. So supporting onboarding for new employees and ensuring that there was a training and integration plan in place for new employees. And so I took that passion for learning, and I moved on to actually work at Purdue University. I worked in ethics and compliance, supporting large compliance educational programs, which was another great experience and helped me to really start engaging more on a large scale, having an impact on an entire organization rather than just a portion of an organization. And from there, took my learning and moved into compensation. I had worked with someone that I really appreciated and moved into compensation, having a lot of experience there. I continued to fall back to that passion about helping others, supporting others, and passion for learning. So worked as a career coach where I worked with my colleague here, Yasir. I was the associate director for professional career development for the Krannert School of Business now at Purdue, and got my executive coaching certification because I supported professional master's programs. So professionals taking on distance learning, so much like yourselves. That executive coaching certification spurred my heart to move more towards the organizational development and talent management aspect. So combining my passion of HR and my passion for learning and supporting others. And that led me to Kohler. So Kohler is a privately owned and a family-owned, privately held organization. It is global. There are about 40,000 employees across the globe, and it is a pretty diversified organization. And I have been there for about 6 months, a little over 6 months, and have really learned a lot and incorporated a lot of my learning into what I'm going to share for you today. So at the risk of being a broken record, everything that underscores my education and experience is my passion for learning about others and understanding their motivation and helping them to define and achieve their goals. And so that is a big part of what today is about. So I'm going to ask that if you have questions at any point, please feel free to unmute, type them in the chat. Yasir is going to help me in navigating that. This is about you all and helping you get what you want out of this. So if you don't mind, what is your goal for this session on managing your manager? What's one thing you might want to walk away with? If you would type in the chat or unmute and share. Anybody? I know I have my outcomes that I'll define.
Okay, so I can read some of the, I believe, insights on the chat box. So Tonya, when to seek manager guidance versus engaging in leadership yourself. If you are in such a leadership position, get help with being a remote team member on an otherwise in-person team. Manage conflict better. I believe the conflict is more like with your manager in this case. Learn how to effectively manage change as a less senior manager of the company, I guess. Oh, there are like so many of them is going.
Yeah.
Build a relationship with manager. When should you speak formally versus informally with a manager? Interest in learning more about how to promote yourself to your manager without sounding like you are bragging. That is awesome. Learning to stand out to your manager and more. But I love it.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
So
Thank you, everyone.
we will definitely be addressing those items as we move forward. So give me just a second here. Here we go. So our outcomes for this are to increase your understanding of how to manage your relationship with your manager through communication and feedback. And I'll provide some tools to support you in how to do this. So there's no one right way to manage your relationship with your manager, and every manager has a different style. Ideally, and a theme you'll see throughout this, you will see that adaptability is important, and that's both on your part and the part of your manager to ensure that you're both investing in making the relationship work to achieve the goals that you're setting out to achieve. So with that, why is this important? Some of the adages that you might hear are that, people don't leave companies, they leave bad bosses, and that can certainly be true. And you have to think about what you can control in that type of situation. We spend how many hours per week at work? Oftentimes, it can lead to spending more time at work than you actually spend with family or friends at certain times. So understanding that you cannot control the behavior of others, namely your manager's behavior, is important, but you can voice your values, your goals, and your preferences. Let me rephrase that. You can voice your value, so what you bring to the table, your goals and preferences, and your values, the lens with which you view everything around you, including in your professional life. You can learn about your manager's goals and preferences, and then intentionally adapt your behavior as appropriate. And Yasir might laugh a little bit because he knows that's one of my favorite words, intention. So with that, I'm hoping that we can think about closing that gap between the expectations that you might have and the expectations that your manager might have to make that relationship work for you and work for your manager. And I know there was some mention of a virtual environment and the impact of being a virtual employee on an otherwise in-person team. There will definitely be some threads of that throughout, tips on and emphasizing certain things as a virtual employee, because it can take a little bit of extra effort in a virtual environment to manage a relationship and make sure that you are intentionally maintaining communication with your manager. So from here, one thing I want to emphasize is that your manager is definitely one of the most important relationships in your work environment. And just like any other relationship, you do have to spend time establishing trust and building rapport beyond your work roles and responsibilities. If you are consistently just focused on, oh, here's my update, here's the outcome, it is going to be difficult to build that rapport and build that trust. I'm not saying that you need to cross over into any realm that makes you feel uncomfortable, or certainly that would make your manager feel uncomfortable, but do make an effort to get to know your manager on a personal level. Um, so that could be just focusing on understanding what's important to them. What do they dedicate their time to outside of work? Is it their family? Do they have specific hobbies that they're really passionate about? Is it more generic? They're a sports enthusiast. Just being able to make note of that, and quite literally, I know some people keep note cards on their managers and make it a point to follow up on, oh, how was your ski lesson that you took last week with your kids? Or what is your New Year's resolution this year? I know you're really passionate about, making a New Year's resolution each year. What does that look like this year? So actually making note cards or OneNotes or Trello files on your manager to ensure that you're able to build that rapport, make a connection, potentially find common ground that you can bond over and deepen your relationship with them. You're not going to be best friends with your manager, right? It's generally not going to happen. It is important to maintain that professional boundary, but you do want to move beyond strictly work roles and responsibilities to build that trust and rapport. What are some ways that you all have done this in the past that has worked for you? And you can type in the chat. Get the chat flowing again. What are your plans this weekend? Pets, yes. Chatting over lunch, asking about travel. Great. Yeah, those are all great things. I know I have, my father is just a natural networker, and he can talk to anyone about anything. And that is not a skill that I have. So for some people, it is preparing your small talk before going into a conversation with your manager. That's okay. If that's what works for you, do that. Prepare your small talk to build that relationship. Yeah, latest illness, certainly during cold and flu season, travel plans. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great things to just talk about and refer back to in future conversations to build that rapport. So when we think about establishing trust and building rapport beyond that, we want to move into addressing alignment. So what is important is that you and your manager understand the context that both of you are operating from. So on a professional level, talking about goals, needs, and work style. So more specifically, we want to move into goals. This is very HR of me, but I wouldn't feel comfortable having a presentation about managing your manager without ensuring alignment across goals. I've been in several organizations, several industries, as you mentioned, and I really think it's important to understand not only your own professional goals and then just annual goals for your role and responsibility within your organization, but what are what are the puzzle pieces that fit together between your goals and your manager's goals, and maybe even your manager's goals, and then even more broadly, the larger organizational goals. You should be able to connect the dots. And if you cannot, you need to have that conversation with your manager. Some managers are not excellent at making this a regular recurring conversation, more along the coaching perspective, right? Managers who view themselves as coaches generally bring this up more often and touch base on progress and where you fit in the bigger picture. If you don't have a manager that aligns to that manager as a coach perspective, then it is up to you to ensure that you have that understanding of the goals and as they cascade down to you. Touching on that also goes into your career goals. So not just your annual goals through your organization, but what are your professional development and career goals? Have you had a conversation with your manager about that? If you haven't, then take an opportunity to set a conversation with your manager saying, hey, I know that we've discussed potentially our annual goals. I'd like to also discuss my development goals and progressing towards increasing your ability to communicate in a clear and concise way. That is one of my professional development goals for this year, for example, or working to be a more active listener. Those types of goals that you know personally relate to your success in your role, but they are more for you to succeed as an individual, not to contribute to your organization's goals. And then along with that, what does success look like for each of those goals? And you may be surprised by that conversation. And this, you could even take this question to your manager about smaller ticket items, not overarching goals or personal and professional development goals. It might be, what does success look like to you for this particular project, for this particular output, so that there's no misunderstanding between you and your manager. Keep in mind that your manager does not operate in a vacuum. There is an organizational culture that operates on your manager, right? They are operating within the culture and climate of the organization they're within. So at Kohler, we have leading boldly behaviors that guide our behavior, our performance, our goals throughout and at every level as individual contributors and as managers. Not every organization I've been in has something so detailed to be a compass or a guide to what success would look like. So it might just be that individual conversation with your manager on specific projects. I think, is there a question? So how can our managers help us with our goals? So as I mentioned, and I want to clarify, Daniel, are you talking about organizational goals or professional development goals? And feel free to type. Okay, I will assume, I'll assume both and share. So organizational goals, I am a little hesitant to say how a manager helps you in setting that, because that varies across organizations. But remember, we're focused on what we can control. So for starters, the first thing is, if your manager hasn't had a conversation with you about your goals or doesn't have regular check-in conversations, you schedule and set up a cadence for check-in on your goals. These are for example, I'd like to meet once a month to discuss progress towards my organizational goals and be prepared to share your successes, et cetera, in relationship to that. There's a lot of research around how to set SMART goals, so specific, measurable, attainable, trackable, reachable, lots of different acronyms for what SMART goals are, but time bound. Those SMART goals, that can help you if your organization doesn't have something in place. That can help you frame the conversation with your manager as well, saying, I'd like to set goals. I want them to be aligned with your goals to ensure the success of our organizational unit, our department, et cetera. And then I want to ensure that they are time bound, that they're trackable, that we have some benchmarks of what success looks like for this goal. So that is one area from an organizational perspective. And from a professional development perspective, that again can vary. Ideally, that should be coming from you, right? You need to do some personal digging and thinking and contemplating on, what are my development goals? Where do I want to go with this? And your manager should be able to have the conversation of, have you thought about this? Or we could support you with this type of training or this type of resource for those professional development goals. Anybody else have anything to add on that?
I can share my story, Nicole, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be resonating with anyone, but regarding my current role. So 2018-19, I was a career advisor working with the Texas A&M University San Antonio. And then again, as part of my professional development, future career goals and aspirations, and I'm like, I have to follow these, the top leaders, like, the people like really making their marks and then creating an impact in the field of the career services. And I came across Faruk Day, so our big boss, pretty much the vice provost, here at JHU on LinkedIn. And long story short, he shared with me the life design concept, the book of designing your life, and then designing your life book. And pretty much like I told my supervisor back in that time, director of career services, hey, there's a concept. It seems like this is the future, right? And then we got the books, so we didn't pay anything. It came from, again, the budget. We had the book clubs. I led it 11 weeks or 12 weeks, whatever. Long story short, I even got the budget. I believe it's the 2000 plus. So I attended the Stanford Universal Life Design Studio. And then after a few years, here I am. I'm on part of the Farooq Day's vision, working under his visionary leadership as director of life design on the graduate program. So I don't know if it's going to be resonating with any one of you, but pretty much if you can really narrow it down your career goals in terms of the profession development goals, where you see yourself in the future, then I believe if you can propose something with the outcomes, why is this important and such to your supervisors, managers, definitely they're going to be supporting you. And then money even is not going to be an issue. Of course, like depending on the, the budget and then organizations you're working, but at least for me, it wasn't an issue that time. I don't know if it's a good story, but I just want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have a fellow colleague in common, Apurva. We've talked about professional development with her and how to get managers to support that. And essentially, I mean, I've written business cases for why training in a certain area would be appropriate. This is the value that the company is going to get out of it. This is the value that our end users are going to get out of this development. This is the value that my colleagues will get out of this particular development. I will be able to share my knowledge. So you can take your tools from business and frame them into your professional development and write a business case saying, these are my goals and outcomes and impact for what I am proposing. I see a question in here before we move on. Okay. We will get to David's question, I think, in just a little bit. And then Edward, what do you do if your manager cannot give tangible examples on how to meet organizational success? Well, you might take that from my experience. I've then defined success benchmarks. This is what I think meets expectations looks like. This is what I think exceeds expectations looks like. And this is what I think, stellar looks like. Do you agree? So you have control over what you propose. If your manager can't provide that, then propose what you think it is and ensure you have agreement from your manager so that when it comes to more formal performance review time, you can track back to, hey, this is what we said success looks like. And I've met, this based on our definition of exceeds expectations. So it's that alignment and agreement on what success looks like that is important if your manager can't provide that. I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time. Understanding needs. So this kind of bleeds into work style as well, but do you understand your manager's preferences, their priorities, their pet peeves, and does your manager understand yours? And as things go, these things change. So maintaining contact and communication to recalibrate on preferences and priorities is really important to make sure that you're maintaining the relationship with your manager. And I will move into making sure here. So I will give an example first. So with needs, one of the preferences that my current manager talks a lot about is their values and their prominent value of integrity. And we had a team meeting and discussing everybody's values and their work styles. And that was a learning point for me. I had worked for her for 4 months at that point. And that was the first time that we had ever discussed that. It's like, okay, that was a miss on my part that I did not know that, that was of the utmost importance to her, and seeing that shine through and be a lens for what she looks at everything through. Um, so when we talk about needs, I mentioned this team meeting. My manager went so far as to have everybody kind of present a little bit about themselves and their work style. And it was great for a team, but could be even a really great tool to talk about one-on-one with your manager. So I'm just putting an example up here and I will talk through some of this with you. So on the right here, this is actually an exercise. I am a Clifton Strengths success coach, if you will, and I have this exercise. It's called the best of me, but you don't necessarily need to align it with Clifton Strengths. And it is really insightful. It's like a personal user manual for you as an employee. And if your manager would be open to it, you can ask that they provide the same. And that helps to cut down on some of the kind of miscommunications or misses that you might have with your manager, and help to deepen your relationship quicker because you understand more about their motivations and more about, where their strengths are, what their personality might look like, what their preferred method for receiving feedback might be, how they like to communicate. So this is just one example of a tool you might use to go ahead and support managing your relationship with your manager. Sharing what you can control, right? These are my needs, my preferences, my work style. And then asking, it would be great if I could understand yours as well. You might have a pulse on depending on how long you've worked for a particular manager, you might have a pulse, but having them define it in their own words can be really beneficial. So diving more into work style, you might think about for yourself and question for your manager, do you prefer to be collaborative and brainstorm together? Yasir with his whiteboard and markers loves to collaborate. He'll be the first to say that. I am a little bit more introspective. And so sometimes I need to think on my own for a little bit before coming together in a group. And that's just something about each of us that helps a manager know and understand how to work with us. The pace with which you might make a decision or your manager might make a decision. So are they quick to make a decision, maybe to their detriment, that you need to pause and maybe even utilize that term? And I've done this with managers. Well, let's pause for a second and think about, what are the options and what are the pros and cons of each, not delaying the decision, but let's make sure it's a thoughtful decision. Or on the flip side, helping to expedite a decision for your manager. Know whether they need a lot of context and detail or data to support a decision. Are they introverted or extroverted? And understanding that just means this is where they draw their energy from. So are you going to see them thriving in a large meeting, a large group setting, where they're engaging with a lot of other individuals? Or are you going to see them thrive in a more intimate, like one-on-one conversation where they're diving in maybe a little bit deeper and engaging in a more meaningful way one-on-one? Direct versus indirect communication. I don't know if any of you have heard of insights. That is something that Kohler does. It's another Myers-Briggs Strengths Finder type personality work style test. And they give you a color, and she consistently says, I lead with red. She's a very direct, blunt individual. I lead with red. I'm throwing my red brick at you. And that's really helpful just to understand, like, it's not personal. This is how I communicate. I'm going to be a very direct person. And brief versus detailed, and I'll give you one guess on what I am. I am a details person, as you might gather. So you can Google, there's a couple of, I think there's like a New York Times article that talks about a personal user manual as a template. I had my other template up there. I think I've also read an article about, I think it was an employee at Microsoft that talked about, it's a how-to guide. So how to Nicole, for example, and insert your name. And it just talks about detailing, how do you work with me? What kind of timing do we need for communication, et cetera. So I will pause for a second. I think I saw yes, I will send this to you, Seer, and I will take off. I did not notice at the bottom these things coming through from the template, which is super unprofessional and not very detail oriented of me. I will take these two things off. Did not notice that as I was practicing. I will send a copy of the slides so you can utilize these tools for sure. We are going to dive deeper into communication. So with communication, we'll talk a little bit about some of the points brought up earlier. So a little bit on what might cause conflict or strife, and how to provide feedback and how to request feedback, right? Some managers are better than others at providing feedback. And I think a big part of managing up is requesting feedback if you're not getting the feedback. You need to know where you stand. A performance review at the end of the year shouldn't be a surprise, right? There shouldn't be any unknowns, because either you've taken the reins to ensure that regular cadence of communication and feedback is occurring, or your manager is adapting and knowing and understanding that you need that. So let me make sure. Here we go. So when we talk about communication preferences, this is one point where it is important to consider life as a virtual employee, if that applies to you. So I am fully remote. About once a quarter, I travel to Kohler, Wisconsin. Most of my team, however, is also remote. And then we have a few hybrid employees. So our team has been able to cultivate a culture where we're building relationships and able to do so through virtual communication and what works best for us. If you are in a situation where you are virtual and your manager is not, and the rest of your team is not, you need to ensure that you are making your presence and contributions known. And we'll go into a little bit of that through one-on-one template that I will share with you. But establishing as a remote employee that communication is important with your manager, and just flat out asking, what type of frequency do you want to communicate with me on? So do they prefer brief, frequent communication? So at least a daily couple of minute conversation, touch base, or less frequent but more lengthy in like a once a week meeting where you engage and make sure you're up to date on what's going on. Mode of communication. So thinking regardless of whether you're remote, in person, etc., understanding how to best communicate with your manager will be important. So some managers are okay with the instant message of choice. So whether that's Google Chat or if it's a Teams message or what have you, for those brief communications, some of them prefer, no, please just put it in an email so I can answer it on my own pace. Some don't mind the drop in if you're in person, or call via Teams, Zoom, etc. So understanding what their preference is there can be really important. And the preference might change based on the type of information, right? So if it is something that is an urgent priority, there may not be any guidelines around communication. If it is not, be careful not to be viewed as someone who's kind of falsely sounding the alarms, right? So don't consistently use Messenger if they've said, really that's what I want you to use, only if it's more urgent matter. So understanding that kind of taxonomy of mode of communication. Duration, I talked a little bit about that, and level of detail. My current manager, as I said, is very direct. She is also really brief. Okay, Nicole, get to the point. Let's be more concise. Let's be more clear. So I have to be mindful of that. But there are senior leaders that I also work with that, they want all of the context, the data. They want everything laid out for them to be able to move forward and make decisions. So being cognizant of that is really important. From here, let me make sure I've covered all the points I wanted to cover before we move into. Yes, I have. Let's move into then tools on one-on-ones to help support communication with your manager. This is a taxonomy or a classification system for points within a one-on-one that you might be covering with a manager. I should step back and say, not all managers choose to have one-on-ones. I have found that they are really valuable for me. You need to make that choice for yourself. But even if you don't have a regular recurring one-on-one with a manager, any meeting that you have with your manager or even a team would benefit from this particular classification. So if you have a large list of items that you want to cover, starting with, okay, this item, I just want to inform you. And that means, there's no immediate input needed, but it's relevant for context in moving forward and progressing. There's also consult. So you might start by saying, I'm consulting on this item. I need you to make a decision. This is my recommendation and I need your input. I'd like to discuss this. And then decide. So we need a firm decision from you as the decision maker, as the manager. I also included vent because I do have, and this is a great part in developing a relationship with your manager. Sometimes you may just need to vent to a manager, right? Oh, this customer was a really big pain today and it took everything in me to get through the conversation with them. Well, they might jump into problem solving mode. And I know there are a good portion of engineers on the call, and I think that's the default mode for an engineer, is to jump into problem solving mode. Like, oh, well, how could we solve that problem? And what did you do? And that might not be what you need in that moment. So prefacing a story or a point with, hey, I just need to vent on this point and then we can move on, is really helpful because it doesn't waste their time on problem solving. It makes it very clear what you need in that moment. you can also take that as a point into personal relationships. This is a tip from a book that I've read called Connect and Relate, which is really wonderful on communication and building deeper relationships. So these are ways that you can classify kind of your one-on-one. And if you're unsure of how to additionally structure a one-on-one or another meeting, you might share a format with your manager if they don't already have a preferred format, saying, hey, these are my priorities. This is where I need support. And this is another point of communicating your value, your successes, and your wins. Here's what I have accomplished over the last week or two or month, whatever the cadence is. Be your own champion. I know there was some mention of, well, how do I do that without sounding arrogant or pompous? Nobody is going to fault you for sharing a success or a win, in particular in a one-on-one situation with your boss. If you don't share a success or win, who is going to be your champion to share that? You really need to take control of that and ensure that your manager is aware of all the wonderful things that you're accomplishing and doing in your role. If you get accolades from a customer or end user or what have you, that's a great thing to share with your manager. Like, oh, that project we completed last week, I got a really great thank you note. I wanted to share that with you. It was a really great win. Simple as that. You don't need to, go on and pat your back, but make sure they're aware of it. And then going back to that point on building rapport and strengthening your relationship, every meeting or touch point should have a couple of minutes dedicated to building that rapport, right? You shouldn't be diving directly in every time. Now, I know that's, there's always an exception, right? Sometimes there are urgent matters and deadlines and things that you're navigating, and that is fine. But for the most part, you should build in a couple of minutes to establish that rapport and strengthen your relationship. In your one-on-ones, you want to ensure that deadlines or important dates are noted. Document for yourself actions that need to be taken. And then that allows you to follow up with your manager, right? And say, oh, in our last meeting, you said that you were going to do X, Y, Z. How is that going? And you want to utilize a tool that is also from that book that I mentioned, Connect and Relate. It is Echo Reflect, and this is also a coaching tool. So if you're unclear on something that you're discussing, for example, a priority with your manager, you want to echo and reflect. And so that's just summarizing what you've heard and repeating it back to them, ensuring that you have clarity on it. So what I hear from you as a priority is X and it needs to be completed by Y. Is that correct? And that's especially helpful for someone like me who can tend to get lost in the details. That is really helpful to echo and reflect to ensure that alignment and clarity in the priorities. And when we think about this, that starts to bleed into feedback a little bit. And we talked a little bit about establishing a regular cadence for feedback. One tool that I've heard people refer to is plus delta. So plus being, well, what is working well and what needs to change? So these are questions that you can ask, and it doesn't have to be in every meeting that you have with your manager, but it should happen periodically to align and check in. So, hey, what's working well? What needs to change? And hopefully they reflect that back to you. So you have an opportunity to provide feedback. on what's working for you and what needs to change. Another question that I like to use in requesting feedback, what is one thing I can do or stop doing to make it easier to work with me? And that can be a really powerful question for a manager to reflect on, right? Because sometimes it's not what they need you to do, it's what they need you to stop doing. So that is really beneficial. But when they potentially give you that opportunity to provide feedback, focus on specific behaviors that that impact you or your goals when you're providing that feedback. So what I mean by that is don't take the opportunity to say, well, you did this because of this, and that made me feel XYZ. You want to avoid assigning motives or attributing intentions to your boss. Thank them for the opportunity to provide the feedback. Reiterate that you value the relationship and the opportunity to improve it by providing the feedback, and think about how you might provide that feedback. So for example, you might say something like, I observed you interrupting me during the last all hands meeting while I was talking. And that really impacted my ability to maintain my train of thought and my coherent presentation. So you didn't talk about anything other than the observed behavior and how it impacted you. And that can be, again, really powerful because it opens up the floor for them to share their rationale, because it's easy to jump to conclusions like, oh, they did that because they don't trust me, or they did that because they don't think that I am experienced enough. Name your jump to conclusion result there. And hopefully that provides an avenue for a real honest conversation around what your boss is doing that is impacting you. So with that, keeping in mind this again, in a virtual environment, providing feedback, you want to think about what the best way to do that is. An email or an instant message might not be the best way to provide feedback because you don't have the immediate opportunity to elaborate. If they say, we'll say more about that, I don't understand what you mean, you wouldn't have that immediate opportunity, or they don't have the ability to read your other nonverbal communication cues to understand your genuine nature of just wanting to improve the relationship and provide feedback. So a video chat is probably the best option for that in a virtual environment. Any questions as we continue forward? I think actually we are 2 questions. So what questions do you still have that you'd like to address or discuss? I know that there was a lot of information there. I provided some tips and tools on how to ensure you're managing your relationship with your manager through communication, through structured communication and open feedback with one another to ensure you're aligned going forward, because everybody wants the same thing, right? Your manager wants you to succeed. You want to succeed and you want to help your manager succeed.
Nicole, we have one question.
Okay.
You see it or you want me to read it?
I see it now. If your goals include growing into a role in another business unit, is it reasonable to seek your current manager's support for that objective? This involves knowing and understanding and having a little bit more of a deeper relationship with your manager. A good manager should absolutely support you regardless of where the next role is, right? A good manager should be your champion and say, hey, absolutely, I get it. You are aligned and interested in this role in this particular business unit, and I want to help you get there. Here is this person that I recommend that you network with, and they should be able to share some skills that you might want to focus on. And so, a good manager would absolutely be open to that conversation, but you have to gauge whether your manager would be open to that conversation. If loyalty is one of their top values, you're going to want to consider the conversation and approach it in the best way possible, saying, I'm really appreciating my time growing here. I do want to think about my next steps and other opportunities. Are you open to discussing that with me? And if they're open to it, hopefully they'll be direct in their communication with you and say, yeah, let's discuss that. And if they get concerned, then you know not to poke that bear and seek that support elsewhere. So another one of Yasir's favorite topics, seek a mentor or a sponsor in that area that can help you in defining and achieving that goal. Any other questions?
You see the second one?
Oh, no.
Are there any additional steps people should take to create a better relationships with their managers if pretty much working completely remote with no cameras?
With no
That's
cameras.
interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, a phone call is also generally more intimate than an email, right? So if it's, hey, can we hop on a phone call for a little bit to discuss something, that helps to provide those additional cues, right? The inflection or tone of somebody's voice, if they're hesitating, if they're stuttering, or if you can hear that they're frustrated or angry or emotional. I mean, those types of things are valuable as well, valuable cues in how to navigate a conversation and build a relationship. Ideally, you would potentially request to be able to travel at least like once a year, right, to a site where you are able to connect in person with your manager, even if it's for a couple of days. And I realize budgets and global locations and things like that, that doesn't always happen, but it is worth an ask if you think that that is a reasonable ask in your company's current climate and culture. Because even just a couple of days together can really increase your bond, because you know that those couple of days you're dedicated, right? You're dedicated to developing the relationship. That's kind of the purpose of those couple of days, the intention behind it. Anything else?
Since it's already 7, perhaps
Yes.
maybe one more questions. If not, I want to respect to everyone's time. Okay, Querida, it could be the last question then.
Okay. How do you open up and improve a relationship with a manager who recently once had the same position as you, but was overly competitive, would steal some of your ideas and would maximize some of them to gain more recognition from his or her boss? So that is a tricky political situation that you have to have an open and direct conversation with an individual. So with managing a manager, you can't avoid conflict, because minor conflicts, so you might call that a pinch, would turn into a crunch if you let it kind of fester over time. You have to be willing to have direct conversation saying, hey, in the past, I have recognized these behaviors, and I support that you are now my my manager, I want to make sure we have a great working relationship going forward. How can we recalibrate our relationship and just go through working styles and boundaries and talk about things that align to your values, that touch on the things that bothered you. So overly competitive, you might say, I really value collaboration, and I really value recognition for my ideas, and I really value honesty. Think about the things about your values that align with what bothered you, about how they were engaging, and then that will help you to frame the conversation and share the feedback. But there needs to be a crucial conversation there. I see a couple more, maybe one more questions. I will respond in the chat, but I do want to let everybody move on with their evenings. I want to be respectful of time. I've really enjoyed my time speaking with you. Hopefully, I've been able to share at least one or two new tips that you're able to take away in managing that all important relationship with your manager.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.